So thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending this seminar on site and also online. Though we couldn't really know how many people are online now, but it's a webinar. But anyway, during this presentation, if you have any questions, I assume you can post them at the chat box, right? It's called Q&A box. That's all good. So this seminar is hosted by UQ AI Collaboratory. You might have known that UQ AI Collaboratory is a significant investment by UQ to support. It's okay. I heard my echo. So by UQ to support research and innovation in AI across different domains. Since we launched this AI initiative, we have organized quite a number of seminars with different themes, and the content covers from AI algorithms to impacts. First of all, the UQ University of Queensland acknowledges the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet. We pay our respects to our ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. The main scope and purpose of our AI Plus seminars is to promote transdisciplinary AI research and collaboration, to connect AI researchers and students UQ-wide, and to engage with impact areas. And of course, the focus area of the talk today is agriculture. We have a range, at the moment, we have arranged 3 seminars in this area in March, April, and May separately. I'm very happy to introduce Scott to give the first presentation today. So Professor Scott Chapman, you give me 1 second to introduce your bio. Thank you. So Professor Scott Chapman is a crop physiologist working on genetic and environmental effects on the physiology of field crops, particularly in drought-affected regions. He uses quantitative approaches and phenotyping to integrate the understanding of interactions of genetics, growth and development, and the biophysical environment on crop yield. And in recent years, his collaborations have expanded more generally into various applications in digital agriculture, from work on canopy temperature prediction for irrigation decisions through to applications using deepfake image analysis to assist plant breeders. So I hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. I'll just get to another presentation. Oops. There's no issue online, is there, Sue or Shiming? Oh, everybody can see it, so good. Just checking, we're getting a bit out of practice not having to do all of our lectures on Zoom right now. So although in agriculture, we've been doing it on Zoom for ages because we've been out at Gatton. So when COVID hit us, we were pretty much ready. We were a pretty online school regardless. So I guess I want to target this a little bit more at a data science community. So some of the people in agriculture who might watch this talk might think that's a little bit boring, Scott. We know all that stuff. Show me the detail. And just move that a little. And so I apologize to those people in advance. They've seen me talk about far more complicated stuff, so I can do that another time. But it is based on a BRIS Science presentation I gave for the Faculty of Science in December last year. So if you want a bit more detail or you want to slow it down a bit more, then have another look at that one. But there is a fair bit of this similar content. So if I get this to work. All right. So I guess agriculture is a big part of UQ. Not everybody knows that. By some methods, we're ranked #2 in the world. So I don't know what the statistical analysis is of every method there is, but certainly in research, we have a big impact in agriculture. And as part of UQ's priorities in building better bioeconomies, we want to increase that impact. And so that means bringing all of the agriculture researchers across the schools and across the institutes to engage with other parts of the university. So I'm really pretty excited to be able to, over the last few years, start developing relationships with, particularly with Faculty of Engineering, Architecture and IT, but also across other parts of science. And I thought I'd just show, let me just, for the people in the room, I need to make this little thing disappear. Where is it? There it is. Hide the floating meeting controls. Just the only reason I put this quite complicated paper up here, and you can read it yourselves. I'm not an author on it, so I'm not promoting my own stuff here. But it's important to realize that global food demand is going to go up by about 50% by 2050, even without climate change. So, you know, we are rightly concerned about climate change and potential impact on food. But when you look at these scenarios, and there's 5 different scenarios here. Sorry, this mouse is a little bit short. I'll have to get a bit closer. That there are 5 different scenarios here, and these are sort of global analyses looking at sustainability and some other scenarios that have come up versus fossil fuel development, right? So if you look at per capita consumption, these are predictions. So this is using climate change data and a lot of global modeling to work out how much consumption is going to be. So that's affected by diet. So, you know, if we all eat certain things that require a lot more energy, then we'll consume more. And so you can look at consumption on that side, and you can also look at supply. But what they've done here is, this is more of a developing world study, is to think about population at risk of hunger. And when you look at these projections out into the future, it certainly says that fossil fuels are the best way to keep the amount of hungry people not so much different to now, although we'd like to reduce that, obviously. So this is the sort of, this is the number on this axis of people who are going at risk of hunger, which is between 100 and 300 million. And the argument made in the paper is that we can use a much more sustainable model to get there with less energy use, but still producing the same amount of food. And there are some other scenarios, which I won't go into, where hunger is expected to increase quite a bit. And that doesn't count wars and other kinds of natural disasters that can occur. And another important point about this is that this doesn't seem to register properly. Global food supply is not assured to come up. So there's been quite a lot of analysis of global food supply, various methodologies. This is a methodology that's been around for a while. It does have some issues with it, mainly with regional precision. But what is being done in this kind of work, a largely US team and with some international partners and including some people from Australia at various times in this work, is to look at climate change over time. So you're using climate forecasting from IPCC climate forecasts, and then interfacing that with crop models. Now, crop models are deterministic models, which I'm going to talk about later, biophysical models that can allow us to predict yield. And the key thing is that they're increasingly pessimistic yield responses. So this team did this work firstly in the late 90s, early 2000s. And since the latest scenario, so this is one of the scenarios, it's actually the one that's the fossil fuel worst one. It seems that for corn, which is a real, you know, the key stock feed of everything that we build in our society in agriculture, originally it looked like it wasn't going to shift much in yield globally. It was about 1% change in production, but now it looks like, looking out to 100 years, or it's only 80 years now, it's likely to drop by about 25%. So we are facing some changes there. Wheat is actually better because wheat is expected to go up, and that's partly because of higher CO2, which gives wheat a free ride, and expanded performance in the higher latitudes as the temperatures warm in those high latitudes. But because maize is more grown in low latitudes, it's going to be more affected by the warmer climate. So there's a lot of dynamics here. And so what I'm trying to say is that a lot of the research that we do at UQ is embedded in understanding that. So I love these kinds of pictures that come out once a year from the food ventures people where they look at the farm tech landscape. I reckon this year the font's going to be so small you won't be able to read anything. But this just gives you a picture of how much excitement there's been in ag tech and farm tech. They have another one that's called ag tech, which includes all the food tech. And there's a lot of dollars going in there, probably a huge number of wasted dollars as well. But I'm not going to talk about all of that detail and more talk about some of the things that people get up to. So here's an example of some nice work that's actually done in the school that most of the people in the room are probably in ITEE. This is some work from Ryan Coe and his team. And I'm just going to give a couple of examples before I get into the depth of my talk. And this is one on food traceability. So this is about assuring the quality of things like meats to make sure that what you get when you receive it in the country where it's been delivered to is actually what was cut and delivered from the slaughterhouse. And so all of these pieces can be video verified in real time. So there can actually be someone wearing a Google Glass while they just check that as it's being packed and someone can assure it at the other end. But also the information is attached to that and traces it all the way through so that when you get it at the other end, you know that's what you actually paid for. Because we know that fraud in food is a big problem. Probably a little bit harder to do this with fish. They all look a lot more similar. But, those are the kinds of challenges people are working on. And I did have this one in here, not because my colleagues, Guido and Ben, who are here working on this project, but I mean, this is another example of some work that's in agriculture, is using natural language processing to help us make better decisions, help growers and researchers make better decisions. And so please talk to Guido if you want to know the current status of that and whether it's running on Telegram at the moment or not. Guido, is it running? I don't know. So you can ask. I don't have the address here to let people test it out, but if you want to know whether snails and slugs are destroying your crop, you can ask Telegram and it can, in theory, it can tell you. So, those are some of the other types of applications. So the body of my talk is really around crop sciences meeting data sciences. And I have to admit strongly that a lot of this has happened 20 years ago, actually more like 40 years ago in most of this big seed companies. I mean, they've been using information extremely efficiently to make decisions about how to breed new crops for a very long time. And certainly that accelerated a lot when molecular markers became available. And then a lot of the challenge in the last 10 years or so has been not necessarily the genetic information, because all of these systems were put in place to handle the huge amounts of genetic data. Every single seed that a company produces these days can potentially be genotyped, or they have often various types of methodologies to accelerate breeding by prediction from that. And that'll be a topic of the third seminar that Ben Hayes and Mark Cooper will talk about, who are both, Ben's an expert in animals and livestock, but works in crops as well. And Mark has a long history and career in one of the big seed companies. So those are you'll be really well informed on that when they give that talk. But just to mention, there's $40 billion in ag tech in 2020. The vacancies outnumber the ag graduates by 10 to 1. So anybody who's doing data science and you're all finding you're fighting over jobs, come and work in agriculture, because we desperately need those skills, and where we have a lot of really interesting challenges. I put this one up because this is how I represent the dynamics of growing crops when I had my touch screen and I was trying to explain this to some people in Europe in real time. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but a lot of what we're trying to do is to understand the dynamics of crops. So I was drawing a few different things here to show how temperature and rainfall accumulates over time. So you might see you can represent rainfall as step events, for example, if you accumulate rainfall. How would we convert all of these variables into continuous variables that we can then input to various types of network learning systems. I'll talk about that in my sort of second last slide, actually. So the theme that I wanted to follow is how we combine AI with other technologies. So these technologies, phenotyping and genetics, crop growth modeling, and remote sensing, are areas where UQ are experts. We are world experts in these areas. And what we know, we're pretty expert in this as well. So what we really want to do is work out how we can really engage AI, stats, mathematics, machine learning, deep learning into our areas and challenges. There's a couple of links here to some other talks I've given, but there are also a lot of great talks on the Coffee website. So if you want to have a look at those, it's the institute responsible for agriculture at UQ, and there's some good talk. They do a talk every week. So if you're not on their mailing list and you want to learn about agriculture, get on to Coffee's science seminar series. So starting with phenotyping and genetics. So this is about how do we, I'm focusing on crop sciences here, and I'm really focusing on how do we deliver better varieties to address food demand in the world. So one of the projects that we work on at the moment is a national one where we've got some partnering across different parts of UQ, and it's called Inviter. So this project's got 3 different work packages on data augmentation, analytics, and simulation. And what we're doing is, if you look at this map of Australia, we've got trials across the whole country. Now, these are national variety trials. They're funded by the grain growers of Australia. Those grain growers are paying for all of those trials, and the data that's coming from those trials are being used by grain growers to make decisions about, should I grow this variety or should I grow that variety? It compares varieties from different companies, and the growers regard it as a fairly important piece of information. What we're interested in doing in this project is saying, well, what if we start to bring a lot more tech analysis into it, mainly through satellites, through field cameras, through drones, and through sensors? How can we bring those technologies to bear to help us do a better job of prediction? Because in the end, even if you're doing 150 trials, 150 wheat trials across Australia is not a really big sample, right? Our wheat area is around 10 million hectares, and each of those trials is 1 hectare. So it's a pretty small sample. And what we're trying to do is see whether we can use weather data and soil data to extrapolate that prediction. I should have put a reference up for this one. This is some simulation work that we're using. One of the things that I'll mention through this talk, and one of the reasons why crop growth modeling is important to us, is we can use crop growth modeling as a way of creating synthetic data sets. So we can synthesize everything. We know all of the data that goes in, including the genetics, if we construct that genetics. And we can do biophysical deterministic simulations of experiments, and then we can apply statistical and artificial intelligence methods on top of it, and we have the ground truth. The ground truth is absolute in a synthetic data set, and we can capture all of that dynamic. What's high throughput? Well, in our systems, we're using drones quite a bit. Here's a drone over a sorghum crop. We use a variety of sensors, thermal sensors, hyperspectral sensors, which can detect a lot of different wavelengths. LiDAR and multispectral cameras are probably the ones we use the most. We don't usually fly the hyperspectral cameras. They're terribly expensive and heavy. You can fly them, but normally we carry those on this tractor system, the Gecko, which was developed a few years ago at UQ. And we tend to use a tractor to do very highly detailed, high precision work. We have thousands of gigabytes of data. So if anybody loves analyzing that kind of data, we certainly have a lot to work with, and it works across all of these scales. And what we're trying to do is work out how to work across those scales to use that information to understand how crops grow in response to the climate and the management that we supply. So there's a whole sensing pipeline behind that. which captures all the information and helps us explore that. And we've also started automating some of our computation of some of these derivative traits, if you like. So I'll take you through a little bit of an example of how we might do this. This is UAV imagery in wheat field trials. So each of these trials is about 7 meters by 2 meters. And we have 2 centimeter resolution from the drone. So last year we flew over 500 flights around the country on all of these trials, not all of them, but most of them in multiple crops. And from that, we can derive sets of traits, we call them traits or characteristics or variables, if you like, that we can then use in making decisions about why is it that genotype does well and that one doesn't do so well. We do other crazy things like walk around with phone cameras and take lots and lots of photos. This is an area where I'd love some help from people who work in human computing interfaces, for example. So this is our high-speed throughput. So you walk through the field and you go click, click, click on the plot, and then you take a photo of the sky, and then you go click, click, and then you just analyze it all later and remove all the sky photos. Because if you actually try to develop any kind of interface that's more than a single button press, the people who are in the field will complain. And they'll say, that's too slow. I can't choose my plot. I can't choose an automatic advance. I can't do. So we have to be quite pragmatic about this, because when you're sending people to drive for 2 or 3 hours to collect data, they need to be able to do it quickly and efficiently. And even when we're using drones, we have to try to come up with procedures that are really efficient, because labor cost and travel time is a big cost for us. So that's one of the reasons why we're interested in trying to use satellites to try and shortcut some of this. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but we're starting to count objects in those. This is a nice graphic that Danny Smith put together today, PhD student working with me. And this is just a summary, and it's from a paper we published recently of the technologies that we're trying to bring together. And here you might see an example. You see where that starts off blue and goes different colors. So when this is an index based on the red edge and the other wavelengths. And what you're seeing, when you see that it'll go all spotty at the end, that's the end of the season. So that's actually a time course of NDRE across the season, and the variability that you're seeing in there is due to the different genotypes that are in the field, and so we can associate that performance with them. So we're trying to bring together environment information, understanding phenology, which is the timing of stages. You know, when does the crop flower and when does it produce yield? Flowering time is so critical in our environments. So when you're in largely dry environments, I know this is not a good year to say that, but in largely dryland production that most of our crops are in, the time in the phenology is really important. And for the winter crops, it's a particular challenge because we're trying to flower late enough that we avoid the frost and early enough that we avoid the heat, and at about the right time that we don't get too much drought. So we're trying to balance that whole thing. There's physical measurements being taken. We're sensing that, and part of what Dan's trying to work on is how to associate this information with the physical measurements that we can take by going out there with a steak knife and cutting lots of plots and measuring things and validating that, and then feeding that into prediction models where we can try to predict performance in different environments. So with one of those kinds of excuse me, with one of those kinds of cover relationships, we can do a couple of things with that. If we know what the cover looks like early in the season, if it's troublesome, so if this cover is extremely variable, sorry, that's yield, but here's cover, we might abandon a trial. And so GRDC might make a decision to abandon a trial, and that might save them a couple of $1,000s. So that's worth doing. But if they don't abandon it, then we want to try to work out how to use that information and whether the understanding of cover early in the season can tell us something about the yield at the end, and also a lot more integration over time. I mean, this is just a simple example. But in general, having a field or having genotypes that cover the ground fairly quickly and establish well, they'll generally yield well. But that's not always the case. If you look at this map of correlations, you can see that some of these correlations are red, negative. So that means that some of these crops, these genotypes that leapt out of the ground and grew really well early, actually were the worst yielding. And that can happen in dry environments, because what happens is if you go too fast, you run out of water and you crash and burn. So there are some situations and some years and some environments where you don't want those genotypes. And you have to investigate what's the probability of those environments occurring and what's the probability that a farmer should grow one variety or not, or another to avoid that. So to move on to the crop growth modelling, I'm hoping, I'm not sure if Graham's online, but I'm hoping to convince Graham and some of the other modelling experts at UQ to give another seminar if we can fit it in later in the year. But UQ is one of the world centres of crop growth modelling and systems modelling. AppSim is the tool we use, which was developed with CSIRO, UQ and the Queensland government. There are now some other partners in New Zealand and Iowa State. And it's the sort of deterministic simulation model that's been used in a whole lot of types of decision making. So a lot of those are not related directly to breeding. They're related to things like, for example, here, this is a crop report from an online tool called Yield Prophet, Prophet, which CSIRO developed with a grower group in Victoria. And this allows them to help growers to make decisions. So run the simulation model. I get to a certain point in the season and say, well, should I put more nitrogen on or not? Is the probability that I'm going to get a good set, an appropriate amount of rainfall to use that nitrogen, is that a high probability or a low probability? And boy, that's going to be important this year. That's going to be really important, because the price of nitrogen is going to be so high that a lot of growers are going to be tending to under-fertilize a bit, but they might be more generous because they made so much money last year. So there's going to be an interesting dynamic to see how that works out. But the model can help you make that decision. So some of the types of work that we've used this for, again, going back to food demand and climate change, is looking at how drought and heat stress might change over time. So with these computer models, we can run them with future climates, and we can start to say, okay, if we look at 1990 was the baseline we used, this is the proportion of environments. It's only, less than 40% of the time in this part of the world that those crops would be expected to have no drought or heat significant impact on yield. Most of the time they will have a lot of it. And if we ran out to 2050, 2070, what we were finding was that the drought and heat was increasing a bit. The drought was probably going to go down a bit. We were going to get a lot more heat with no drought. So one of the things that's being worked on well at UQ in sorghum particularly, but there's also some work in wheat, is we know that a lot of that heat impact is on grain set. So if you get severe temperatures around the time that plants are trying to produce their grain, then you can have sterilization of the pollen, for example, which will reduce the yield. And so we can model that and we can anticipate that. And we've got researchers working with breeders to work out, can we find genetic solutions for that? And can we breed those varieties so that we're ready for that when it comes in the future? So, breeding has to be anticipatory, because it takes you somewhere between, well, it depends. 4 to 5 years would be insanely fast, but most varieties are going to take sort of 8 to 10 years to actually cycle around and deliver a new variety. But I think the important thing is that if you look at these blue bars here, when we look out to the future for both sorghum and for wheat, in our Australian environments, we are looking at losing yield due to both of those in the future and losing more than we are now. We might have a reduction in the drought, but we're going to pick it up in the heat. And I know you won't recall all the detail that was in my second slide, but that global analysis didn't seem to indicate this for wheat. So I think it's wrong. I think our stuff's probably better and more accurate being locally done. So these deterministic models, again, I won't go into the detail of this. If you'd like to learn about it, come and do my crop physiology course. I'm happy to teach you. But the environment inputs are typically weather and soil information. And we model all of these processes of how does the crop develop? How does it develop leaf area? How does that leaf area become biomass? So how does photosynthesis and water capture and nitrogen utilization all come together to capture light? So we want to capture light and turn that light into biomass and eventually partition that to yield. So all of that gets captured quite well in these models, and there's some of this work is looking at genetic parameterization of these models, so working out how to parameterize different genotypes and use that to inform breeding programs. So that's one of the things we're doing in VITA. Here's some results where we've used 165,000 data points from the last 6 or 7 years of these trials, and we've started to try to fit models. So this is using a deterministic model plus weather data to try to predict the flowering time. So this is we want to see what date it actually flowers and how do we get there. And we have to parameterize 360 cultivars differently to do that. Now, in this case, we use brute force. We just set up a massive parameter set and found the best sets. We are looking at doing that better because we want to use some of the known genetics to do it better. We know we can do that. We've already shown that in the past, actually. But the brute force one gives us a better answer in known data sets. So the brute force actually works quite well. But we'd be pretty happy to use something other than brute force because we know there's lots of other ways of exploring these big spaces. And as we explore more and more complex problems, and we have more than one trait to fit and more than 3 parameters, brute force doesn't work anymore. And we have to try some different things. And that's another thing we'd like to talk to you guys about. I left out a lot of slides here because I didn't want to overbear you too much with this big project, but we're looking at predicting sorghum biomass across the US. So we're working with Purdue University in this. And it's the same thing. We're building these crop growth models, populating them, and then running them. These are different classes of genotypes of sorghum. And we're looking at where do these yield the best amount of biomass in different parts of the US under rain-fed or irrigated conditions, and also how's the performance of some of these genotypes associated with genetics. So how do we understand the genetics of crop growth rate, particularly associated with photosynthesis, for example? And that's bringing together a whole lot of phenology and modeling. I put one slide in that I borrowed from Mark a while back. I'm not going to talk about this slide at all, you'd be glad to know. I saw Lee Hickey was online. I could ask Lee to do it if he wants, but I would expect that Mark might comment on this in that third seminar, but there's a lot of sophistication in how plant breeders are using information now to make predictions. So a lot of the work was based around mixed models historically in the last few years, and how do we capture environment effects and use mixed models to do that. But now what's happening is there's the embedding of a crop growth model into the statistical model of how these yields come about. So what you're then trying to do is work out, how do I estimate the parameters of growth performance for all of those genotypes simultaneously? So this is being done in real time in some breeding programs to make decisions so that you can select for the genetics that target particular growth responses and not just blunt brute force yield at the end of the season. I put a couple of slides in here in the second presentation in this series by Andres Potgieter. He'll go into a lot more detail on a lot of this stuff, but I only talk about it in how it touches on what we're doing in this national network. So we're collecting data from 2 different satellites, in particular Sentinel-2 at 10 meter resolution and Pleiades at 0.5. These are satellites that are collecting data every few days. We also get data from Planet, which comes through every day. And so we can collect that data. Planet's at 3 meters, sorry. So we can collect that data throughout the season, and then on these chosen dates, we can order some satellite imagery through a commercial company at high resolution. So we can order this high resolution stuff. We have to pay for it. It's quite expensive. So we can't afford to order it every week. But what we can do is order it periodically and then try to work out how do we calibrate that high resolution stuff against these others. And one of my big challenges, which I would love any student to come on, take on with us, is how do we best calibrate between our UAV data and the satellite data? Can we bridge that gap up to the 0.5 meter? Because our plots are only 7 by 2 meters. So you only have a few pixels. So you need some fancy statistical spatial modeling to try to do that. There are a bunch of other challenges too, which including the fact that satellites don't actually align terribly well. They're really precise in the relative positions of the tiles, but sometimes the whole picture is off by a few meters. And so then we have to bring it back. We need also to automate some of these challenges. This is just introducing the CropFen project, which Andres leads and I'm engaged in, and it has 2 outputs. One is to use satellite data to work out what crop is in the field, because we would like to know a long way ahead of time what crops are out there. When you've got 10 million hectares growing crops, if we know what the crop is, then we can start to predict its yield and predict other attributes of it. And another thing that Andres is working on, and Fred Rooster from School of Mathematics and Physics is working on this as well, is how do we understand phenology through the season and then use that information as part of our yield forecasting models. So Andres has led a lot of research for the last 20 years at UQ in yield forecasting. So he builds simpler models. We don't use AppSim to do that. We use simpler models to do that. But what we're getting closer to is being able to forecast the yield for every 10 meter pixel in the country, essentially. And we're trying to work out good ways of tuning that and using climate forecasting to estimate that yield even before we plant it. So if we can guess what crops are going to be planted where, which we can do based on history, we can use satellite history. We can work out, pretty sure it's going to be a wheat crop there, pretty sure it's going to plant about that time. We can build algorithms to work that out. And then we've got a climate forecast, which is 6 to 9 months out. We can start to forecast what we think the yields are going to be before we even plant the crops. And that's something that we haven't really been able to do terribly well. Okay, the last part of my talk, which I have about 10 minutes left, is that okay? Is to just talk about a couple of other examples where we've really tried to engage in the AI mathematics spaces. So I already mentioned that we use field cameras to watch wheat grow. So this is the kind of imagery you might see. And Swanee's up the back. She's one of the people who looks after this. So we take lots of pictures of how wheat grows. Not terribly exciting. But here are a whole lot of field cameras at these sites. It's just a trail cam. So it's taking 4 photos every day. But what we're able to do with that is, with a bit of geometry, we can calculate what the cover is on the ground and how that might associate with the speed at which that crop's growing. So what's its leaf area and how quickly is that leaf area increasing? And that helps us inform, just realize I keep stepping out of the shot. That helps us inform our crop models. So here's an example where we trim this kind of image, we binary mask it with some decision trees, and we can start to produce these fractional cover over time. This was our 2020 data. A lot of the cameras didn't get into the field early enough in the season, so we're missing a few of these start points. But when we did have validation from the drone, we were getting pretty good comparisons. The other part of this work I wanted to mention, because it kind of fits here, is some really nice work done by Sophie Chen, who's also here. Sophie's been working on a really hard thesis for the last 2 or 3 years. one of the things we're interested in is how do we best convert all of that spectral data that we can collect with a drone or either from a satellite or from a drone, how do we convert that to traits that matter to us? So it's fairly easy to calculate cover, we just need some thresholding, but how do we estimate the leaf area index of a crop that's got all these leaves everywhere at different angles and presented in different ways? And one of the ways that we look at this is to try to invert a model. And so there's quite a nice model that allows you to take inputs of sort of leaf area index and other attributes of the leaves and to calculate how that might relate to reflectance. But you also want to go back the other way. So if you've got reflectance, you want to go back the other way. And the only way to go back is to really to build a machine learning model that goes between the two. And this has been a challenge around for the last 20 years. There's been a few people working on it. And Sophie's doing some really nice stuff in this space where we use synthetic data sets to do that kind of prediction. And here's an example, which is actually using real data, where we've got a radiative transfer model. So we take the input parameters and we simulate reflectance. And then what we've got to do is basically build a machine learning model so we can invert it. And what that allows us to do is these are the time courses of leaf area index and some real trials. So this is real data that we took out at Gatton back 2019, and using either the UAV data or Sentinel or the satellite data, we can start to try to reproduce these curves, at least the patterns of these curves. So that one's only using random forest regression, but the more complex models are using things like feed-forward neural networks. And that was done in conjunction with Rocky Chen and some of the people in ITW. I'll only put this slide up briefly because Andres will talk about it in more detail. Where in the research in CropFen are using deep learning neural network models to try to discriminate amongst crops. So trying to take that satellite imagery that's extremely dense at 10 meters per field, or sampling those fields. We're trying to work out ways of sampling fields efficiently. So how many pixels do we need to sample to try to say, yeah, that's definitely barley or that's definitely canola or whatever. But these are all using neural network models to just choose categories. They work really well, particularly since you can vote, right? Because you've got a lot of pixels in the field and you're going to keep saying, well, 99% of them say it's barley. It's probably barley, not canola. So the fact that our crops are mostly monocrops makes that a little bit easier. The other project I want to mention is this ag feature extraction machine learning project that we've been doing for the last year or so, originally in conjunction with Anders Ericsson, but now we've asked Helen to help us out with this one and Yadan and her team. And in that work, we've been trying to use machine learning to count organs that we see in images. Now, it doesn't sound very exciting, and to a lot of my crop scientists colleagues, they say, why do you want to count stuff? We can do a lot of the prediction without the counting, but some of this is starting to help us understand a little bit more about how is yield partition. So how do different varieties partition yield on different numbers of spikes or different grains per spike? Can we understand that dynamic? Can we exploit it somehow? But also the numbers of plants and numbers of heads in the situation can be an input to some of our crop models. So it's part of the way that we build those. I won't explain the detail, but we're trying to do that. And we're interested in two things. One's object extraction and the other is semantic segmentation. We're not doing much work in this space, so people are really interested in that. We'd be keen to work on it. Our colleagues in France are doing quite a bit of work in semantic segmentation, and using these UNet kind of models, they're able to separate out vegetative material versus heads or background or whatever, and then they can focus in on that and try to find diseases, because diseases attack certain parts of plants. So if you can separate out the parts of the plants, you can better identify the diseases. I think for most of this audience, I don't need to talk about how object detection and extraction works. The thing I wanted to highlight is some nice work that's largely been done by Chris James, who's now a PhD student with me, and Yang Gu, who was a postdoc on this project, but recently left. So she was working with myself and Anders. And what we were finding, we were trying to design robust ways of deploying feature extraction into our models. And one of the ways to do this is to try to get better domain performance. So if we train it on a set of images, so we annotate it and build a detection model, if we go to another domain, so these photos are from Indiana, sorghum being grown in Indiana. These are from Australia and Warwick. The performance can be poor. So sometimes if we test in domain A, it works. If we test in domain B, it doesn't work. And so what Chris has deployed now is a nice pipeline for accommodating this. So we take these domain A images and apply again generative adversarial networks to convert these to domain B. So the nice thing is that all of those heads stay in exactly the same spot, but they have a different style. So that means that all of your labeling is efficient because you've labeled everything and labels stay in the same place. He actually did write some clever stuff to find all of the weird labels, because sometimes it will generate some strange artifacts and you have to go and remove those, otherwise your labels don't work. But it's worked rather well, and that really improves the model. And I should have put this slide in before I showed you that, but it's basically, this is a nice way to show it. Chris chose this one. You've got a content image, a style image, and an output image. So you can see what capturing style is about. And here's some examples of some real images from Australia, some real ones from Purdue, and some synthetic ones here. And the nice thing is that when we do this, here we've got about 50 heads in an image in most of these pictures. And we get an error of about 10. We undercount. We almost always undercount. In feature extraction, you don't overcount too often. We undercount all the time. And if we do it with original images, even if we've got 600 images, we still undercount. Whereas we start using synthetic images, we start to get really good precision. So one of the things we're trying to work on, and we're starting to engage with one of Helen's students in this space, is to try to work out how to make this really robust. In that work, we worked with a whole group to develop a global wheat head data set. I'm going to skip over that one. That's just some other models. This is the last one I wanted to show on this, is that, so Chris just took that model as it was. Now, it needs a bunch of tuning, right? Because it's counting heads when the plants are like this. So some of those, shapes that you see on the ground or in little plants must look a bit like heads, and the model thinks they're heads. We're not too worried about that because we know that there aren't any heads at that stage. But what we can do is we can retrospectively check this camera and we can see where this starts to take off. And we know there's a fair bit of error in here and we still got some tuning to do. But it gives us a pretty good idea of when that flowering date is from that real live camera. And that's really important, because if we can see this happen, then the contractors who've got to go and drive 200 kilometers to the trial can go, look, that plot's starting to head. And the reason we need a machine learning model is you don't always have 4G. So you might want to have a machine learning camera convert it to data and send it via NB-IoT or satellite, because you can't send images by NB-IoT because they're too big. So we have all these kind of data challenges that we have to deal with at the same time. But this is very pragmatic. This model's not running brilliantly here. It's missing a lot of heads, but it's doing the job we need it to do. And we'll test this because we've got thousands of images to test it on. We'll make sure it's working. This is the last slide on this work. I'm just shocked that for $200 we can build a machine learning camera that we can walk through the field and count all the heads with. And pragmatically speaking, that's quite useful, because there are people in the ag industry, for example, whose part of their job as agronomists is to go out and scout for damage. So when you have frost events and heat events and flooding events and drought events, farmers can't get, the insurance company's not going to pay out unless you can demonstrate what the damage is. And so we could potentially use machine learning cameras to go and document that damage if we can count them and extract that information. So the other area we're interested in is putting cameras on everything. I love having cameras on all of this stuff. I hate speed cameras and I hate those. I'm pretty good with this though. I don't touch this anymore, I can tell you. But you know, I think we're going to have a lot of opportunities to exploit that, even to the point of calibrating our yield monitors. We might be able to use cameras to do that. So I had these two slides in here from my Bris Science talk. And again, this is actually some work from Helen and also from engineering, is what can agriculture borrow next at UQ? And we're really interested in being able to do real-time analysis of these things if we want to put stuff on tractors. And I love this work from Ross McRae and the team, you know, where they've automated how bulldozers work together to uncover spill and spoil and that kind of thing. And we think, you know, as we're getting increasingly automated in agriculture, we think there are those opportunities for getting equipment to work together are really important. That's my last slide, but I'm not going to put any detail on it. I just wanted to mention it because Dong's done some really nice work in this. It's just one more machine learning example. It's a hard one. So if you really want a hard one, come and sort this one out. He's designed this cross-modal transformer model. And what we're trying to do is take that sequence of weather data and crop growth data from completely synthesized data sets. So we have thousands and thousands of these simulations. And the key thing that's differing for a lot of the simulations, well, the weather varies for all of them, but we change the soil type. So we change, if you imagine the soil as a bucket of water, we change the size of the bucket. And my challenge to him was, you've got to guess what the bucket is. He's got to work out, he's got to build a model to work out how big is that bucket? Is it a little bucket? It's a big bucket. Because if it's a little bucket, then in a year where it doesn't rain much, you should see a strong signal because the crop's going to be yielding terribly. In a year where it yields a lot, the little bucket's going to do quite well, and so is the big bucket. So you've got to design a model that can actually use multi-year data to try to understand what the soil is. And he's getting pretty good at it. This is a 5-category simulation, and it's working there. These are different categories of soil buckets. It starts to fall apart as the bucket gets bigger and bigger because you don't have enough signal to work with. So this is, there's a few PhDs in this one, so I'll leave it at that. Just to say, it's another tool in the box for agriculture, and to thank a very large number of people I work with in a large number of institutions. And also, if anybody's been over to Gregory Terrace lately and been to the top of Gregory Terrace, let me know if the mural is still there that I had the fortune to do with Madeline Holt last year, when Maddie came and had a few conversations with me, looked at my data sets, and then she drew this. And I went, all right, so that's her impression as an artist of what my science is about. I hope that my talk was not quite as abstracted as what Maddie's put there, but thanks very much for joining me and hearing about this introductory talk in the series. Thanks.
So, you know, I'm always impressed by your knowledge of computer science, including machine learning, computer vision, and everything. So I was wondering whether you are a professor of computer science as well.
No, but I've worked with data my whole life. So I was that close to being an engineer. And I guess a lot of us who work in crop growth modeling at least have we have an engineering mind to some extent, because that's how we try to interpret things. But data science has been very essential to all of my work for all of my career, and in statistics and things as well. But no, the last 3 or 4 years is I know a lot less than I perhaps sound like I know. So.
Because the theme of the seminar today is more the agriculture-based AI or web-based agriculture. So I have a very general question. So how widely or how deeply the AI is applied leveraged by your field? Is there any figure or indicator that can demonstrate the impact of AI on the field?
Oh, a good question. Look, it's certainly been adopted a lot in the end parts of supply chains. So I know several companies who are working on tracking quality of food as it goes through processing. So strawberries, you'd be surprised because sometimes you get some pretty dodgy strawberries, but I mean, a lot of strawberries go through a packing imaging system. I think something like 70% of potatoes in Australia go through a single factory in South Australia and get graded. So you might have noticed how when you go to the supermarket these days, the potatoes come in all these different grades, and you buy different sizes and whatever. That's all gone through automation. And that's the last 5-10 years that's happened. A lot of our fruits and a lot of our vegetables go through those kinds of systems. There are companies I know of who are working on things like image analytics of sweet potatoes as it comes out of the paddock. So off the machine, which is a big challenge, is an industrial challenge. And then there's a lot of analytics going on in markets and in food, sort of production and prediction. And there's certainly a huge amount of data science in breeding companies. So companies like Bayer and Corteva and Imagery and Syngenta, all of them have appointed quite a few data scientists and actually they appoint all kinds of people, physicists, but a lot of people with a lot of strength in mathematics and data science. So the seed companies, absolutely. A lot of food quality and processing. And I guess there's a lot of people, the other big area is probably in utilizing satellite imagery and trying to use that in decision making. And there's a lot of companies supplying a lot of tools, but the big challenge is how well those tools can really help farmers make better decisions. So I think the decision support part of it is still, that's probably where the bigger challenges are in the market, is how do you show how to get value out of that?
Yeah, they're all very exciting stories. I know you have a lot of connections with our display, with our schools. The research what we are doing is just a foundational research, but it's always good to know that the outcome of research can be applied, transferred into real products to create real value in this place. Opportunities in our future.
Shazi?
Yes, yeah. Thank you, Scott. That was very inspiring, actually.
You ask a question.
So thank you for really inspiring talks, Scott, and I've heard a few of your talks, and I'm blown away every time by, the extent to which, like what Helen was saying, kind of the bread and butter of our students, see all those indications of actually. So really inspiring to see. I have a question about synthetic dust. You mentioned them a few times. Very general question. What is the acceptance in the sector of studies that are based on synthetic dust, both in the scientific community as well as in the industry?
I'll just repeat Shazi's question. So the question was, what's the acceptance of synthetic data sets or the use of synthetic data sets in the research community and in the applied? Bit hard to answer, and probably not a lot of it being used. Yeah, I mean, certainly the concept of using crop systems models to understand risk and to help make better decisions with respect to risk, that's been there for a long time. So that's, we've been using those for, AppSim is 30 years old, and cropping system modeling is like 60 years old. It's older than me. So I think from that point of view, the use of deterministic modeling has been a long history, so that probably helps. But synthetic data to train machine learning and deep learning and things, well, we know that it's working quite well in our image analytics. So, and in fact, I don't see Chris is here, but Chris James, who did a lot of the object feature stuff on the head counting, he and I are trying to work on synthetic approaches in that. So how do we, there are 3D models of how plants grow, and we're trying to work out how to use that understanding. We can connect those to our biophysical models, so we drive them with proper inputs, and then we can start to impose virtual heads and stuff like that. So you certainly can use synthetic data well in image analytics, like you already do in a lot of fields. Synthetic data in those sort of temporal relationship interpretation and things like that. Look, there's not many papers in that space. I think the nice thing is that when Sophie publishes her work, it'll be quite exciting, because we actually wrote a whole paper on it, and the reviewer said to us, "We want to see it validated." I said, "Oh God." And so Sophie actually went back to our data sets and then revalidated it. The model was totally developed on synthetic data, and we put it on real data, and it works really well. And the thing is, we can't possibly develop it on real data, because we cannot do enough measurements even with this fancy kit that we have to actually validate that. So I think we'll see more acceptance of it. I don't know what the criteria is going to be for acceptance in the scientific literature. I guess we'll find out, because one of Sophie's papers under review at the moment. So I hope but we'll see. That's a good question though, because I think we do have to generate a lot of that synthetic data to build these models. Yeah, I was just checking. Marcus. Oh, someone asked a question. Is the ML algorithms running on the Raspberry Pi? Good question, Sen. Actually, the ML algorithm is run inside that camera. That's a machine learning camera. So if I go to that camera, hopefully I explain what synthetic data was. Computer vision in pests, probably not my key area of expertise, but in one of my courses, actually, we started using Google Teachable Machine. And we just took a bunch of imagery. I had students just go and get imagery and try to classify different types of things. I mean, that type of stuff I think is pretty easy for that kind of work. I did have, I'll put the machine learning camera up again just for a second so you can see it. But the Raspberry Pi, the only thing the Raspberry Pi is doing is to tell the camera to run. It's not actually doing, the camera itself is doing all of the machine learning calculations on its own, and it costs $150, which I find extraordinary. But so Sen, if you want to buy one, get online, or I've got a spare one if you want to come and work on it. Yeah.
Any other question? Yes, Scott, you're in a room of computer scientists.
Not engineers.
And I saw one who, ran diagram and said AI is what ML and statistics.
Oh yes, I know. A little bit upset. I think that AI has expanded its definition to include all types of statistics and maths to help it gain acceptance. Because a whole bunch of things that I used to understand were just statistics now get called AI. And I go, oh, really? I thought that was just, or even people referring to PCA and things as essentially AI. And I go, yeah, it's just comparative stats. Yeah, no, it is. But yeah, I probably should work out what's the best words to put there. Good point. Thank you. Well, good. I'm probably going over time. Yeah. A little bit.
All right. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks very much.